So going beyond mere ideology or speculation of the overman, which oftentimes gets obscured with the Ubermensch, which Jason Reza creates a clear distinction, where you have the higher tier man, which really you kind of have to create the tapestry of this jurisdictional zone when you look more at Dostoevsky's Underground Man, or Posts or Letters from the Underground, where you're looking at what society does to the individual when the individual is trying to play off the merits of an assumed middle point of mediocrity and banal existence, where you begin to see that man aspiring toward God status was never meant to live in such an egalitarian, democratic, mediocre state, and that this ever striving toward being the higher man ultimately leads to an entire other quantified junction point or quadrant or zone of existence where man begins again, not as a man, but as a god. So we begin to look at the mythos that Jason Rizzatorgiani speculates and postulates, but more so looking at Joseph Campbell and those famous interviews with Bill Moyer back in the 1980s that really take this context into a higher state of meaning, where we look at Sisyphus, we look at the Adonis, we look at Heracles or Hercules, we look at Gilgamesh, and the idea transmorphs into an actual living being, the embodiment of an Aeneid or a Jesus-type figure that Nietzsche talked about when he was discussing Zarathustra or Zoroaster as a forerunner, the Persian forerunner to, some say, Jesus Christ, right, or this messianic figure that didn't become the Ubermensch or the higher state of the beginning, the nurturing state of this god status, because he was stronger, i.e. the Adonis, because he was smarter or outwitting or cunning, which you get into a lot of the Babylonian lore, right? When you begin to look at Marduk, more of a warrior type king, or Tiamat, the machinating wiles of the feminine, where her lover and her soldier, top general, conquesting warrior, Kingu, was both her lover and her son, right? And then you have all the depictions of, really, you could say, the other zodiacal figures, right? As to say that if you were to take all 12 of those months and amalgamate them up into one entity, you would come up with this sort of 13th figure that was only the 13th because there was this transmorphing or this transcendence, as Maslow in Maslow's hierarchy of needs really wanted to get into, where you have this leveling up into this god status. And so when you begin to look at it and you really take things to the extreme, where you're looking at the Adonis, you're saying that anyone who performs the action of self-improvement and takes that on to what we would esteem now as a sort of tier system or professional status. You could even look at it, like with Pierre Proudhon's mutualism, creating that one who can create a product that's worthy of sort of this Hiram Abiff, right, exchange, where that joint system is so superior that only a few could understand, and that the information became quantified within the individual, processed and passed on like a Promethean torch throughout generations to create this line, right, of these generations that, again, when you get up to the 13th generation, you now have the manifestation, or the 21st generation, as seen as Phi or Phi formulation, you now have the representation of the perfected man. So these gods really create this tier system to say Gilgamesh shouldn't be forgotten there, or Hercules, because, or the Aeneids, right, where you begin to see that there wasn't just like this oral tradition passed down of a euphemistic storytelling, but that it came so close to us that we now have to live under the guise of speculation, this messianic figure, right, Jesus, or Ralph Ellis's Michael Tessarian's King Isus, the unclaimed throne, the warrior king, the rebel, right, as to take on and champion this principal cause and to transmorph through the process. So in this respect, we see what Jason Rizzatorgiani is really pointing out when he's looking at Prometheus, right? Or when you are looking at this adversarial figure that brings everyone who is stuck in the mediocrity of this midpoint thought, brings them to this conclusive outcome that we are all going after the same thing, and we are upholding and having to admit that we aren't that Ubermensch or that Overman, right? But that we're preparing the world for this event.